At first light on December 27, 1939, the forest east of Suomussalmi lay silent under 40 centimeters of snow. The temperature hovered near minus 35 Celsius. Breath crystallized, metal burned skin. Somewhere along the narrow road that cut through the pines, 800 Soviet Red Army troops were closing a ring around 31 Finnish soldiers. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, trucks, nose to tail on the road. Numbers alone said this would be over by morning. The Soviets believed the geometry was perfect. Infantry pushed in from 3 directions. Blocking detachments sealed the road behind the Finns. Flares marked positions. Orders moved down the chain. A pocket formed, neat and logical, on a map. Encirclement meant pressure. Pressure meant surrender. The men inside were exhausted, frozen, low on ammunition, no artillery, no armor, no radio link to higher command. 31 names against 800 rifles. For the Finns, the reality was colder than the air. Their white camouflage blended with snow that swallowed sound. They had skis and local knowledge, but little else. Ammunition had to be counted by the handful. Food was rationed by the mouthful. If the ring tightened as planned, there would be nowhere to run. The road was a trap. The forest was endless. Every step off the packed snow could sink a man to his thighs. A single mistake would echo like a gunshot. Soviet officers looked at watches and maps and saw certainty. Trucks idled, engines coughing in the cold. Mortar crews set their sights. Machine guns were sighted to rake the trees. The assumption was simple and comforting. Mass would crush resistance. The forest would funnel the enemy. By dawn, prisoners would be marched out, shivering and compliant. The Finns did not see a pocket. They saw time. Night was still on their side. The temperature would fall another 5 degrees before morning. Fuel would thicken. Fingers would stiffen. Orders would take longer to travel. In the dark, the forest stool belonged to those who moved quietly and thought small. As the ring closed, snow began to fall again, light and steady, erasing tracks as fast as they were made. Somewhere in the trees, 31 men waited, not to break out, not to surrender, but to let the trap finish closing. By morning, the Soviets expected silence. What they would get was division, and that division would decide who survived the forest that brutal winter. The Red Army moved the way it had been trained to move. Columns advanced along the road because the road was the only certainty in a forest that stretched unbroken for hundreds of kilometers. Trucks carried ammunition, food, spare parts, and wounded men. Infantry walked beside them, rifles slung, boots crunching on packed snow. Heavy machine guns and mortars followed behind, dependent on the road for movement, dependent on schedules and orders written hours earlier. This was how modern armies fought. This was how numbers were brought to bear. Soviet doctrine assumed control came from cohesion. Units stayed together. Orders flowed down, reports flowed up. Firepower solved resistance. If an enemy was surrounded, the enemy was finished. The map showed a clean circle tightening around the Finnish position, and the officers trusted the map more than the forest. They had no reason not to. 800 men could not be threatened by 31, not in daylight, not with machine guns, emplaced and mortars ready. The problem was that everything depended on the road. The trucks could not leave it. The guns could not be dragged through deep snow without hours of labor. Radios crackled with static in the cold, batteries draining faster than expected. Messages took longer to reach forward units. Platoon commanders waited for instructions that arrived late or not at all. Still, confidence held. The Finns were invisible, which meant they were hiding, which meant they were weak. From the Soviet perspective, the forest was empty. No muzzle flashes, no movement, no return fire. Patrols pushed a few dozen meters into the trees and came back reporting nothing. Silence was interpreted as collapse. The assumption spread that the enemy was conserving ammunition, waiting for surrender terms, or already slipping away in panic. But the columns kept moving, and with every meter, They stretched thinner. Supply trucks lagged behind infantry. Gaps opened between units. A platoon here, a TES company there, separated by bends in the road and walls of trees. Each segment still believed it was part of a solid whole. Each believed support was minutes away. By mid-morning, orders went out to tighten positions and prepare for final reduction of the pocket. Machine gunners adjusted their fields of fire. Mortar crews warmed frozen tubes with bare hands. Officers glanced into the forest and saw nothing threatening back. The encirclement felt complete. What they did not see was that the road had already become a liability, and the silence in the trees was not weakness, it was preparation. Inside the trees, the Finnish soldiers did not talk about breaking out. They did not talk about holding the road. They talked about firewood. In the countryside, wood was cut into short stacks called MOTTI. Each stack was small enough to burn, small enough to move. A big pile was useless unless it was split. That idea mattered more than bullets. The Finnish leaders were not generals with maps spread on tables far away. They were junior officers and sergeants standing in the snow with frost on their eyebrows. They watched the Soviet columns move and saw a pattern. The enemy stayed on the road. The enemy moved in long lines. The enemy needed trucks, fuel, food, and orders to stay strong. If that line was cut, the strength would leak away. The plan was not to fight 800 men at once. That would be suicide. The plan was to turn 800 men into many small groups that could not help each other. One group at a time. One stack of firewood at a time. That was the heart of MOTTI. The forest made this possible. The Finns knew every rise and dip. They moved on skis that made almost no sound. White coats hid them against the snow. At night, even a few meters of distance could swallow a man whole. They did not need to hold ground. They only needed to move faster and think smaller. Preparation was quiet and quick. Trees were marked, not cut yet. Paths were chosen that avoided the road. Ammunition was checked again and again. Each man knew his job. No shouting, no whistles. Signals were hand signs and touch. Every step was planned, because a wrong step could mean death. The risk was total. If the Soviets saw them first, there would be no second chance. Machine guns would tear through the trees. Mortars would fall blind and deadly. 31 men could vanish in minutes. The Finns understood this. Fear did not leave them. It just stayed quiet. As the light faded and the cold deepened, the Finns began to move. They did not rush. They slid into the forest in small groups, spreading out, leaving no clear trail. From the road, nothing changed. Trucks still idled. Guards still watched the trees. The pocket still looked closed. But the men inside it were no longer waiting. They were no longer surrounded in their own minds. They were setting the shape of what would come next. When the Soviets looked again, the enemy was gone. What remained was a road, a forest, and a trap that had not yet been noticed. The first cut came without warning. A truck near the middle of the column lurched to a stop as its front axle snapped against a fallen pine. The tree had not been there minutes earlier. Engines idled, then died as fuel thickened in the cold. Drivers climbed down, boots slipping on ice, shouting for tools. Before orders could reach them, rifle fire cracked from the trees. Short bursts, close. 2 men fell. The firing stopped as fast as it began. Elsewhere on the road, another tree dropped, then another. Saw marks showed where trunks had been weakened earlier, cut just enough to fall with a shove. The road narrowed into choke points. Trucks were boxed in, unable to turn, unable to reverse. Infantry tried to move into the forest, but the snow swallowed their legs. Every step off the road cost time and strength. White shapes flickered between the trees and vanished. The attacks lasted minutes, sometimes less. A burst of fire, a grenade tossed from behind a trunk, then silence. The Finns did not stay to fight. They took weapons, food, and boots from the fallen and disappeared again. When Soviet soldiers returned fire, there was nothing to hit. Bullets tore bark and branches. Snow fell from the trees like dust. Confusion spread faster than fear. Units tried to report contact, but radios failed or messages collided on shared lines. One platoon did not know the next had been cut off. Officers shouted orders that could not be heard beyond a few meters. Smoke hung low in the cold air, marking places where engines had burned too long. By afternoon, the road no longer felt like a lifeline. It felt like a cage. Groups of soldiers clustered around trucks, waiting for orders that did not come. Others pushed forward, only to find more trees, more fire, more dead ends. The column was no longer a column. It was pieces. As night fell, the temperature dropped again. Frostbite began to claim fingers and toes. Wounded men lay where they fell because stretchers could not reach them. Food was still in trucks that could not move. Ammunition was piled in places now cut off by forest and snow. Only then did Soviet commanders begin to understand. The enemy had not escaped. The enemy had not surrendered. The enemy had broken the force apart, using the road against it. 800 men were now many smaller groups, each surrounded by trees, cold and silence. The trap had closed, but not the way it was meant to. The fighting that followed did not look like a battle. There were no lines, no charges, no clear start or end. It was a slow grind made of cold, hunger, and fear. The Finns returned again and again, never in the same place twice. A short burst of fire in the dark, a grenade tossed into a cluster of trucks, a single shot from the trees that dropped a sentry. Then silence, broken only by the wind moving through the pines. The Soviet groups tried to dig in. Shovels struck frozen ground and sparked. Snow walls went up instead, thin and weak. Fires were lit to keep men alive, but the smoke gave away positions. Each fire became a marker in the dark. Each marker drew another small attack. The Finns watched and waited, choosing when to strike and when to leave. Food ran low first. Bread froze hard as stone. Soup could not be heated without fuel. Men grew weak. Frostbite spread, turning toes black and useless. Ammunition was wasted on shadows and noise. Every shot fired into the forest felt pointless, but doing nothing felt worse. The waiting ate at nerves faster than hunger. The Finns stayed disciplined. They did not rush. They did not chase. They took what they needed and moved on. Boots were stripped from the dead. Rifles were gathered and carried away. Each small group of Soviets shrank day by day, not from one great attack, but from many small losses that could not be replaced. When some Soviet officers tried to break out, they ran into the same problem. Deep snow slowed them. The forest hid their movement, but also trapped it. Ski patrols followed from a distance, cutting off paths, guiding them back toward other pockets of trapped men. Escape turned into another dead end. By the time the largest group was reduced, resistance was weak and scattered. Many were too cold to fight. Others were too tired to stand. The forest had done most of the work. The 31 Finns had not destroyed 800 men in one blow. They had let winter, hunger, and fear finish what the MOTTI had begun. When the shooting stopped, the forest did not change. Snow still covered the ground. The road still cut a thin line through the trees. But the balance of the fight was clear. The Soviet unit that had moved with 800 men no longer existed as a force. Many were dead. Many were captured. Others had fled into the woods and never returned. Finnish losses were small by comparison. Against the numbers, it felt unreal. This fight was only one part of the Winter War, but it showed the truth of it. The Red Army had more men, more guns, more supplies. Finland had forests, cold, and soldiers who could act on their own. The MOTTI tactic turned size into weakness. Long columns became easy targets. Orders that took hours became useless. Strength meant nothing if it could not be brought to the fight. Word of these battles spread fast. Other Finnish units copied the method. Roads were cut, columns were split, small groups were crushed one by one. At places like Suomussalmi and along the Rate road, entire Soviet divisions were broken the same way. Foreign armies took notice. Military schools studied the maps. Officers underlined one lesson: again and again. Do not fight the enemy where he is strongest. Fight him where he cannot adapt. The world had expected Finland to fall in weeks. Instead, the Red Army paid a heavy price for every kilometer. When the war ended in March of 1940, Finland had lost land, but it had not lost its army or its will. The MOTTI tactic became a symbol of that survival. Years later, soldiers would still study these fights, not because of the numbers, but because of the thinking. 31 men did not defeat 800 by force. They did it by breaking the problem into pieces. The forest made it possible, but the idea made it work. In war, traps are usually built by those with power. In that frozen forest, the trap was turned inside out. The men who were meant to be hunted chose the ground, chose the time, and chose to survive.